When war swept across Europe and reshaped every corner of German society, the countryside appeared, at first glance, to be a place apart, an expanse of fields, forests, and far-stretching farms, seemingly insulated from the immediate fury of destruction felt in bombarded cities. Yet this perception was deceptive. If the urban home front cracked under the weight of air raids, industrial collapse, and mass evacuations, the rural world endured a slower, quieter, but equally profound transformation. The war did not simply brush across the countryside. It seeped into every barn, well, kitchen hearth, and farm path. It infiltrated the rhythms of the soil, altered the intimate structure of families, and reshaped the emotional and social roles of women in ways that would echo long after the conflict ended. This introduction explores the larger landscape in which rural women lived, worked, carried burdens, forged new identities, and endured the immense pressures of a world unraveling. Before the war, rural Germany was defined by deeply traditional gender roles. Farming families depended on rigid patterns of labor, in which men were the primary field workers and protectors of property, while women held the household together through domestic labor, child-rearing, and supportive agricultural tasks. Life was physically demanding, but predictable, structured by the seasons, the demands of crops and livestock, and the long-standing customs of village life. In many regions, families had lived on the same land for generations. Women inherited not only recipes and spinning skills, but also the unspoken rules governing rural morality, community obligations, and the rhythm of rural womanhood. Yet even in this world of tradition, rural women were far from passive. Their labor was essential to the survival of farms, and their role as guardians of household economy meant they controlled the inner pulse of rural life. The war disrupted this balance with startling speed. As conscription pulled millions of men from their homes, women in the countryside were thrust suddenly into roles that blurred the borders between domestic and agricultural labor. What had once been a partnership became a solitary struggle. Farms that required multiple workers were left to the hands of wives, mothers, daughters, and grandmothers. Horses needed harnessing, fields needed plowing, barns needed repairs, and livestock needed tending, regardless of whether the hands available were weary, frightened, or inexperienced. In many regions, women found themselves performing the kind of heavy labor that even peacetime farming men considered demanding. The absence of husbands, brothers, and sons reshaped not only the workload, but also the emotional atmosphere of the rural home. Silence filled spaces once lively with male conversation, and the pressure to maintain the farm's productivity became a weight that bore down on every waking hour. While women's responsibilities expanded dramatically, the demands placed on agricultural production increased. The countryside was expected to feed both the military front and the home front, and the government's food policies turned farms into essential war assets. This placed rural women under intense scrutiny from authorities who monitored grain quotas, livestock inventories, and field outputs. Women who were already strained by labor shortages now faced inspections, paperwork, and penalties for failing to meet production targets. The pressure to contribute to the war effort transformed farms across Germany into sites of national obligation, where every loaf of bread or liter of milk became part of a broader wartime machine. Rural women, once confined to the domestic sphere, found themselves negotiating with officials, cooperating with or resisting local Nazi authorities, and navigating a complex web of state expectations. At the same time, the countryside became a place of enforced multicultural interaction. Forced laborers, prisoners of war, and foreign workers arrived throughout rural Germany in large numbers, recruited or compelled to perform the work left behind by German men. Their presence changed the social landscape of villages, creating tension, suspicion, and occasional clandestine solidarity. Women found themselves supervising male laborers who were often older, stronger, or unfamiliar with German farming methods. They learned to manage not only fields but also interpersonal dynamics shaped by fear, political indoctrination, and the moral complexities of war. Some interactions were cooperative, others were fraught with anxiety or mistrust. In this environment, rural women had to balance the demand for labor with the dangers of crossing social or political boundaries established by the regime. Daily life on the rural home front was further strained by rationing and scarcity. Although the countryside produced food, rural families did not enjoy abundance. Many farms were required to surrender a portion of their harvest to state authorities, leaving limited supplies for their own households. Clothing, fuel, soap, and tools became increasingly difficult to obtain. Women who bore responsibility for household management were forced into a kind of relentless creativity, stretching ingredients, mending old garments, bartering with neighbors, preserving whatever produce they could, and navigating increasingly complex ration systems. Scarcity changed the texture of daily life. It frayed tempers, created divisions within communities, and tested the limits of women's resourcefulness. Yet, beyond the physical demands and material shortages lay an even deeper layer of experience, the emotional reality. Women in rural Germany carried the psychological burden of uncertainty like a second skin. The arrival of letters from the front, sometimes hopeful, sometimes heartbreaking, sometimes permanently absent, became a defining ritual. Women read and reread these letters, absorbing every word as both comfort and torment. They bore the responsibility of maintaining morale at home, comforting their children, and shielding them from the worst truths about the war. Nights were often restless, filled with worry for husbands, sons, and brothers whose fates lay beyond their control. Grief became a constant companion as death notifications arrived with increasing frequency. Widows were left not only with emotional devastation, but with the daunting task of preserving farms in the absence of their partners. Even as the war dragged on, the countryside did not remain untouched by violence. Allied bombings occasionally hit rural rail lines or military depots nestled among fields. Columns of refugees moved through villages, bringing stories of destruction that seeped into the rural consciousness. In the war's final months, the chaos of retreating German forces, collapsing administration, and advancing Allied armies transformed villages into uncertain zones of conflict and anxiety. Women hid their sons from the Volkssturm, guarded their homes against looting, sheltered children during nights of distant artillery fire, and confronted occupying troops with fear and a cautious hope for peace. When war swept across Europe and eventually tightened its grip on Germany, the countryside felt its tremors long before the first bombs fell or the first front collapsed. Rural Germany, imagined by many as a quiet stretch of farmlands, rolling meadows, dense forests, and deeply traditional life rhythms, was thrust into a whirlwind of change almost overnight. Though distant from urban centers where political fervor and industrial mobilization dominated, the village lanes, barns, and farmhouses became front lines of a different kind, a front defined by endurance, improvisation, and an unyielding struggle to maintain the lifelines of the nation. Food was power during wartime, and the women of rural Germany, whether they had chosen this path or were thrust into it, became the custodians of that power. Their fields became their battlefields. Their labor was both duty and burden. Before the war, agricultural life had been physically demanding but structured. Seasonal rhythms dictated tasks, families, often large and extended, shared responsibilities, and social traditions preserved a sense of stability. But when war erupted, it dismantled the balance piece by piece. Men were conscripted in waves, leaving farms unattended or inadequately staffed. Women, elderly parents, and children suddenly became the sole labor force responsible not only for feeding the household, but also contributing to the national supply. The state, recognizing its dependence on rural productivity, issued directives, quotas, and restrictions affecting almost every aspect of agricultural and domestic life. Women found themselves navigating not only the physical challenges of farm work, but also the new pressures of wartime bureaucracy. The first months of mobilization brought a strange mixture of chaos and determination. Rural communities, accustomed to hardship and self-reliance, attempted to adapt with resilience. Yet the absence of men created a void that no amount of determination could fully fill. Tasks that once required the strength of multiple farmhands were now completed by a mother, her teenage daughter, and perhaps a grandfather well past his prime. Repairing machinery, maintaining livestock, tilling expansive fields, all required long hours and relentless energy. The government encouraged women to join agricultural labor units, and propaganda romanticized their contributions, yet the reality was far from glamorous. Bodies ached, exhaustion became routine, and every season carried the risk of falling behind. But duty was not merely a reaction to state pressure. For many women, it was intertwined with identity. The land was more than an economic asset. It was heritage, memory, and future. Farms had been passed down for generations, and abandonment was unthinkable, even as war made that responsibility feel overwhelming. Women stepped into the roles of farm managers, decision-makers, and laborers simultaneously. They negotiated prices, planned sowing cycles, rationed feed, and dealt with local authorities. Many, for the first time, learned to operate tractors, repair plows, or tend to large animals without assistance. The rituals of rural life, milking at dawn, harvest festivals, evening chores, acquired new meaning under the strain of war. The countryside itself became militarized, not in the sense of constant combat, but through the discreet presence of the state. Uniformed officials, ration inspectors, and agricultural overseers became familiar figures. Posters urged production increases, and loudspeakers in some villages broadcasted wartime announcements. Even the natural landscape seemed changed. Fields expanded as hedges were torn down to maximize yield, and makeshift storage buildings appeared in small communities. Traditional boundaries blurred. Land that once symbolized stability now symbolized pressure, expectation, and surveillance. Beyond physical labor, rural women faced a growing emotional burden. The countryside's isolation, once cherished for its calm, intensified feelings of loneliness and fear during wartime. Letters from the front arrived sporadically, leaving unanswered questions about the fate of husbands, brothers, and sons. The weight of uncertainty clung to daily life. A woman might spend the morning repairing a fence, the afternoon tending cattle, and the evening anxiously reading a letter that offered only vague assurances. Communities offered support, neighbors helped neighbors, but the emotional landscape remained rugged and unpredictable. The war inserted itself into even the most intimate spaces of rural life. Births, marriages, illnesses, and funerals continued, but each was marked by the absence of the men who had once framed family life. Women handled all responsibilities that life presented, raising children, caring for aging parents, managing financial matters, and nurturing the farm, even as their own mental and emotional endurance was tested. The rhythms of rural womanhood changed, shaped by a world far beyond their fields, yet deeply felt within them. For many women, the war also forced a renegotiation of identity. Traditionally defined roles, wife, daughter, homemaker, expanded into roles of laborer, leader, and logistical planner. Some women embraced the transformation, discovering strength and skills previously untapped. Others felt overwhelmed, caught between expectation and exhaustion. But all, in their own ways, participated in a monumental shift that redefined rural German society. Despite the mounting hardships, hope lingered in small forms. a well-tended vegetable patch that survived an unusually harsh winter, a new calf born healthy, a harvest that exceeded expectations despite inadequate labor. Rural communities nurtured traditions that preserved a sense of continuity, church gatherings, seasonal celebrations, communal workdays, although often stripped down or adjusted to wartime constraints. These rituals served as emotional anchors, reminding women that their efforts sustained not only their households, but also the spirit of their communities. Propaganda emphasized rural heroism, portraying women as pillars of strength who sustained the nation through their toil. But behind the carefully crafted narratives lay complex truths, moments of despair, conflict with authorities, resentment over quotas, and fear of failure. Women often walked a difficult path between compliance and resistance, between pride in their work and frustration at the immense pressure placed upon them. The fields were both sanctuary and burden, grounding them in the familiar, while demanding more than ever. As war progressed, the countryside became a zone of increasing vulnerability. Aerial threats, refugee movements, and shortages crept into rural areas. Yet even as conditions worsened, women persisted. They rose before dawn and worked until dusk, finding solace in routine and necessity. Their efforts fed soldiers at the front, civilians in cities, and displaced families journeying through devastated regions. In an era defined by destruction, rural productivity became a thread holding together what remained of social and economic stability. In many ways, the story of women in rural Germany during the war is a story of transformation, not only of roles, but of landscapes, communities, and inner worlds. Fields that once reflected the predictable cycles of life now symbolized the unpredictable demands of war. Households once anchored by male presence became matriarchal out of necessity. Communities that had thrived on tradition adapted in unprecedented ways. When Germany plunged deeper into war, the countryside became a zone of relentless labor, defined not by the roar of artillery, but by the quiet, constant strain of feeding a nation at war. With millions of men drafted into military service, women stood at the center of an agricultural crisis that demanded more from them than any previous era had required. Fields that once relied on the coordinated rhythms of family labor, hired workers, and seasonal help were now largely tended by women, children, and the elderly. As the war intensified, so did the pressure to meet production quotas, keep farms functioning, and maintain the harvests that sustained both soldiers on the front and civilians at home. The burden of the harvest became not only an agricultural challenge, but a profound emotional, physical, and societal test for rural women across Germany. The early years of war already made clear that women would need to shoulder unprecedented responsibilities. Farming was never light work, but the absence of able-bodied men amplified every task. Fields needed plowing, seeds needed planting, animals required tending, equipment demanded maintenance, and produce had to be harvested and transported. Traditional male tasks suddenly fell to women, who had neither been trained nor physically conditioned for them. There was no option to decline. Neglecting the fields meant hunger, government penalties, or both. And so women stepped forward, driven by duty, survival, and the weight of expectations placed upon them. Every season brought new trials. Spring planting required stamina and precision. Without men to guide machinery or handle horse plowing, women adapted through sheer perseverance. They learned to manage large animals, often with a mixture of fear and determination. Machinery that broke down had to be repaired with limited parts and scant mechanical knowledge. Improvisation became a skill as essential as strength. Implements were patched with wire, tools were repurposed, and broken equipment was used until it simply could not function anymore. The ingenuity of rural women kept the countryside alive. Summer harvests, once an occasion of communal festivity and collective effort, became exercises in exhaustion. The government's emphasis on agricultural output pushed women to their limits. Entire days were spent cutting, binding, and stacking sheaths of grain. Long hours under the punishing sun created a cycle of fatigue that lasted from dawn until nightfall. Hayfields needed turning, root vegetables needed attention, and orchards demanded careful management. Every missed task had cascading consequences, and so rural women stretched themselves thin, often sacrificing sleep and personal well-being for the sake of their farms. Children became essential laborers during these years. Boys and girls alike were pulled from school during critical agricultural periods, joining their mothers in the fields. Even young children helped by gathering small crops, feeding animals, or carrying tools. Many rural children grew up faster than they should have, their childhoods shaped by the war's demands. Elderly family members also contributed, sometimes pushing their bodies beyond safe limits. The entire household became a tightly wound machine of necessity. Compounding the physical challenges were the unyielding demands of wartime authorities. Agricultural quotas were enforced strictly, and failure to meet them resulted in fines, seizures, or accusations of hoarding. Inspectors traveled village to village, ensuring that crops were adequately maintained and that nothing was being withheld from state distributions. Women, already strained by the sheer volume of labor, now had to contend with bureaucratic oversight that scrutinized their every decision. The pressure to maintain high yields, even in poor weather or under supply shortages, created a constant atmosphere of stress. Fuel and fertilizer shortages further complicated their efforts. Without adequate fuel, tractors sat idle, forcing women to rely on manual labor or horse-drawn tools. Fertilizer scarcity meant diminished yields even when all labor demands were met. Seeds, feed, and spare parts became precious commodities, and securing them often required navigating long queues, complex regulations, or bartering networks within villages. Women became managers, negotiators, and logisticians, as well as laborers, balancing scarce resources with an ever-growing list of responsibilities. As the war dragged on, exhaustion became embedded in rural life. Women often described feeling a numb determination, a rhythm of work that left little time for thought. The daily schedule rarely changed. Early morning chores, long hours in the fields, midday cooking and cleaning, afternoon labor, and evening tasks that stretched well into the night. Winter brought some relief from field work, but introduced new challenges in caring for livestock, maintaining equipment, and preparing for the next season. For many, winter was a time to repair what the war had worn down: fences, roofs, tools, and bodies. Despite the hardship, the countryside forged strong networks of mutual support. Women helped one another during harvest seasons, shared tools when possible, and exchanged knowledge about coping with shortages. Communal threshing events persisted in some villages, though often stripped of festivity and infused with an air of grim determination. Cooperation remained essential. One farm's failure threatened the entire food supply of a region. In these seasons of crisis, women discovered not only their individual strength, but also their collective resilience. Emotionally, the burden of the harvest carried deep weight. Every task completed alone echoed the absence of husbands, fathers, brothers, and sons. The fields themselves became reminders of those who once worked them, and women often labored with a mix of determination and sorrow. Letters from the front, when they arrived, were read in moments snatched between chores. Many women carried the anxiety of not knowing if the men they loved would ever return. Yet despite this emotional strain, they continued working because survival depended on their endurance. As Germany's war fortunes declined, the agricultural demands intensified further. Bombing raids disrupted transportation, making rural output even more critical. Refugees arrived in the countryside, needing food and shelter. The army requisitioned animals and tools, and shortages worsened. The burden placed upon rural women reached its peak in the final years of the war, when the expectation to produce clashed violently with the reality of dwindling resources and overwhelming exhaustion. Still, through all of this, the harvests continued. Women found a way. They adapted, innovated, and persevered. Their work kept families alive, fed cities strained by air raids, and supported soldiers fighting on distant fronts. In many ways, they became the unseen backbone of the war effort, heroic not through dramatic acts, but through the steady, unbroken rhythm of labor performed under extreme pressure. As the war intensified and German manpower dwindled, the countryside became increasingly dependent on foreign laborers, prisoners of war, and forced workers to sustain agricultural production. This transformation reshaped rural life profoundly. What had once been small, insular communities rooted in tradition and familial social hierarchies now became sites of complex and often tense interactions between German farm families, mostly women in charge, and a diverse influx of outsiders brought into the countryside by wartime necessity. Chapter 3 explores this intricate, morally fraught, and deeply consequential chapter of rural German history, revealing how foreign labor became both a lifeline and a source of tension in the daily struggle for survival on the farm. The labor shortages that plagued Germany appeared almost immediately after the first waves of mobilization took men from the countryside. While the government attempted to fill the gaps with local volunteers, youth programs, and elderly helpers, these measures were far from sufficient. Agriculture required immense physical strength and long hours, and the state quickly recognized that domestic labor sources could not meet demand. Thus began the systematic recruitment and later coercion of millions of foreign civilians and prisoners of war from across occupied Europe, many of whom were sent to work in rural areas. Early in the war, some foreign laborers arrived as volunteers seeking employment, often from economically struggling regions. But as the war expanded and the demand for workers grew urgent, the German regime increasingly relied on forced labor, men and women who were transported under duress, stripped of rights, and placed under strict surveillance. By the mid-war years, nearly every German farming community hosted foreign workers: Poles, Soviets, French prisoners of war, Ukrainians, Belgians, Dutch citizens, Italians after 1943, and workers from other occupied territories. They represented a mosaic of languages, religions, and backgrounds, thrust into the heart of rural Germany under circumstances beyond their control. The arrival of these laborers dramatically altered daily farm routines. Women managing farms were instructed by authorities on how to oversee foreign labor, enforce regulations, and maintain discipline. The government imposed a hierarchy that governed every interaction. Workers from Western Europe, particularly French and Belgian POWs, often enjoyed slightly better treatment and more autonomy, whereas Polish and Soviet laborers faced strict curfews, harsh surveillance, and severe penalties for minor infractions. Many were required to wear identifying badges, reinforcing their lower status and ensuring continuous public visibility. For rural women, the presence of foreign laborers brought both relief and anxiety. On one hand, the additional labor was indispensable. Tasks that had become overwhelming due to the absence of men now became manageable. Foreign workers plowed fields, tended animals, repaired machinery, harvested crops, and supported day-to-day farm functions. Without them, agricultural production would have collapsed, crippling the nation's already strained food supply. For many women, practical necessity overshadowed ideological expectations. They needed help, and the laborers provided it. Yet the social and emotional dynamics were far more complicated. Women found themselves in supervisory roles traditionally held by men, responsible for enforcing regulations and ensuring productivity. Some struggled with the moral weight of authority, facing situations that challenged their personal values amidst wartime propaganda and social pressure. Others attempted to maintain fairness within the constraints imposed by the state, offering small kindnesses, extra food, warmer clothing, or moments of conversation, despite the risk of punishment. Living conditions for foreign laborers varied widely. Some farms provided basic but humane accommodations, often repurposed barns or spare rooms. Others housed workers in overcrowded sheds or poorly insulated barracks, offering minimal comfort. Rations were typically insufficient, and workers depended heavily on whatever scraps they could secure. Despite these challenges, many foreign laborers formed fragile support networks within the rural environment, sharing resources, skills, and moments of solidarity. Relationships between farm women and laborers were shaped by necessity, proximity, and the unpredictability of human connection. While some remained strictly professional, others evolved into friendships or mutual respect forged through shared hardship. Such relationships, however, were heavily policed. The regime feared fraternization, particularly between German women and foreign male workers. Any sign of closeness was met with suspicion and potential punishment. Women could face public shaming, investigations, or legal consequences, while foreign workers risked brutal reprisals. Despite this, moments of compassion and human connection persisted, a quiet form of resistance against the dehumanizing policies of the state. Conflicts also emerged. Cultural differences, communication barriers, exhaustion, and the power imbalance sometimes caused friction. Instances of theft, often driven by hunger, heightened tension. German authorities portrayed forced laborers as dangerous or inferior, shaping public attitudes in ways that sometimes fueled fear or mistrust. Yet in many rural areas, long months or years of working side by side softened or complicated these stereotypes, revealing the emotional complexity beneath official propaganda. Prisoners of war constituted another crucial labor force. French and later Italian POWs were particularly common in agricultural areas. Their treatment typically aligned with international conventions early in the war, granting them limited autonomy and allowing contact with local families within supervised boundaries. In many cases, POWs became familiar figures in rural communities, assisting in heavy labor, joining meals during harvest, or performing seasonal tasks. For women managing farms, POWs often represented a more reliable and skilled workforce than other forced laborers. The situation, however, deteriorated as Germany's war fortunes worsened. The influx of Soviet POWs, who were denied basic protections, introduced severe suffering into the countryside. These men endured starvation, disease, brutal oversight, and in many cases, fatal working conditions. Rural women witnessed these conditions firsthand, their emotional responses shaped by shock, fear, or helplessness. Some attempted small acts of kindness, smuggling food or offering water, while others distanced themselves to avoid state repercussions. The moral landscape grew increasingly fraught as the war dragged on. By the late years of the war, the number of foreign laborers in rural Germany had reached staggering proportions. Farms that once employed a handful of workers now relied on entire groups of forced laborers. The countryside became a microcosm of the vast forced labor system that sustained Germany's war economy. And though rural women did not design this system, they lived within it, benefiting from the labor on the one hand, grappling with its moral implications on the other. When war stretched its reach into every corner of German life, the rural household, once considered a sanctuary of self-sufficiency, became a battleground of scarcity, adaptation, and constant negotiation with the state. Chapter 4 explores the intimate, everyday struggles of rural women as they confronted rationing systems, shortages, and the gradual erosion of the material foundations of domestic life. While cities faced dramatic and immediate crises due to bombing and supply chain disruption, rural communities fought their own quieter but relentless war, the struggle to keep households functioning with diminishing resources and growing demands. At the outset of war, many rural families believed that they would weather shortages more easily than urban populations. Farms produced food, after all, and village networks remained resilient. Yet, as the conflict deepened, the state tightened its control over agricultural output, requisitioning goods at increasing rates. What remained for farm families, especially for women managing households alone, was often shockingly sparse. Ration cards, distribution quotas, and strict inspections infiltrated every level of domestic life. Even households surrounded by fields of grain or pastures of livestock could find themselves short of bread, fats, or fuel. Basic staples such as sugar, butter, meat, and cooking oil became luxuries. Soap grew scarce, forcing women to craft homemade substitutes from ashes or leftover fats. Clothing wore thin, and fabric became nearly impossible to replace. Women patched garments repeatedly, turning worn-out shirts into children's dresses, reworking old bed linens into work aprons, and salvaging every scrap of material available. Shoes, often the most difficult item to replace, were repaired with makeshift soles cut from used tires or wood. Nothing was discarded unless it was truly beyond use. Managing rations became a daily arithmetic that demanded precision and creativity. Women learned to stretch ingredients in ways they had never imagined before. Vegetable peels were boiled for broth, fat drippings were saved religiously, and foraging became a seasonal necessity. Many rural women knew the land intimately and relied on wild berries, mushrooms, herbs, and roots to supplement meager supplies. Some cultivated small side gardens specifically for household survival, plots that escaped official quotas and provided essential nutrition during lean months. Fuel shortages brought new hardships. Without coal or adequate firewood, heating homes and cooking became major challenges, especially during harsh winters. Women and children spent long hours collecting twigs, pine cones, and fallen branches from forests. Ovens were heated sparingly, often shared between neighbors to conserve resources. Laundry, once an arduous but predictable task, became nearly impossible without sufficient water, soap, or heat. Women improvised washing methods, scrubbing garments with cold water, sand, or handmade lye mixtures. Livestock care posed its own challenges. Cows, pigs, and chickens demanded feed that was increasingly rationed. Sacrificing an animal for family consumption required official permission, and discovering unauthorized slaughter could result in penalties or confiscation. Women walked a delicate line between survival and compliance, striving to nourish their families while avoiding confrontation with the ever-watchful authorities. Some quietly bartered with neighbors or discreetly hid small amounts of produce, eggs, or milk for private use. These acts, technically illegal, became essential tools of endurance. Beyond material scarcity, the rural household was under psychological siege. The constant pressure to meet state quotas created tension and fear. Inspectors arrived unannounced, checking pantries, barns, and cellars for hidden food. Their presence intruded upon the private sphere, eroding the traditional autonomy of rural homes. Women often felt judged, questioned, or treated with suspicion, despite their exhausting efforts to meet both family needs and government expectations. Mothers carried the heaviest emotional load. Keeping children fed, clothed, and warm became a full-time struggle. Illnesses that once would have been easily treatable now became dangerous due to shortages of medicine. Even simple colds could escalate without proper nutrition or warmth. Women improvised remedies from herbs and folk traditions, revisiting practices their grandmothers had once used. Community knowledge, Recipes for cough syrups, poultices, teas, and salves became a precious resource. Scarcity also reshaped social relations within villages. Sharing, borrowing, and bartering grew more common, but so did suspicion, envy, and quiet resentment. Families who appeared to have more, even if gained legitimately, became the subject of gossip. The stress of rationing strained relationships that had once been unshakable. Yet acts of generosity persisted as well. Neighbors sharing a handful of potatoes, a warm loaf of bread, or a few spoonfuls of lard during desperate times. These moments of solidarity softened the harshness of wartime scarcity and kept communities from fracturing entirely. Despite hardship, women worked tirelessly to preserve a sense of normalcy for their families. They celebrated modest holidays with whatever they could gather, crafted handmade toys for children, and maintained cultural traditions in simplified forms. Maintaining these rituals, Christmas gatherings, Sunday meals, seasonal festivals, offered psychological comfort and continuity. They were reminders that life, even under siege, still held meaning. The rural household also absorbed waves of displacement. Refugees, evacuees from bombed cities, and relatives fleeing devastated regions sought shelter in farm homes. Women fed extra mouths with already limited resources, shared sleeping spaces, and extended emotional support to the traumatized. These newcomers added both strain and companionship, reshaping household dynamics in unpredictable ways. By the final years of the war, scarcity reached unprecedented levels. Famine loomed in many regions, and desperation drove people to extreme measures. Some dismantled furniture for firewood or slaughtered the last animals they had hoped to keep alive. Women stood at the center of these decisions, bearing the responsibility for survival while coping with the emotional toll of loss and deprivation. Yet even in the bleakest months, creativity flourished. Women crafted ersatz or substitute products, coffee made from roasted barley or acorns, flour blended with ground potato skins, and spreads created from mashed beets or turnix. These substitutions became symbols of both endurance and the absurdity of wartime scarcity. The emotional world of rural German women during the war was shaped by distance, uncertainty, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. While cities faced immediate devastation from bombings and industrial collapse, the countryside endured a quieter but equally profound emotional strain. Women who had spent their lives within tight-knit family structures found themselves abruptly thrust into positions of leadership, isolation, and emotional endurance. This chapter explores the inner landscape of mothers, wives, and widows on German farms, women whose hearts bore the weight of war as heavily as their bodies did through labor. For many wives, the departure of their husbands marked a turning point that reshaped their entire existence. Letters became the fragile threads that held marriages together across vast distances, often arriving sporadically and offering only glimpses into the lives of men at the front. Every envelope was opened with trembling hands, carrying both hope and dread. Some letters were warm and reassuring, others hinted at fatigue, despair, or fear. Women read them again and again, drawing emotional strength from familiar handwriting. These small pieces of paper became cherished artifacts of connection, tucked into aprons or hidden under mattresses for safekeeping. At the same time, the absence of husbands created an emotional vacuum within rural homes. Responsibilities that were once shared now fell entirely on women, whose days stretched from dawn until late night. The combination of physical exhaustion and emotional strain created a unique form of loneliness. Conversations that once filled the kitchen or barnyard now echoed only in memory. Women often found themselves speaking aloud to absent partners, seeking advice, voicing worries, or simply filling the silence. This solitude was compounded by the isolation of rural geography, where farms sat far apart and opportunities for gathering were limited by wartime restrictions. Widows faced an even deeper emotional challenge. They carried not only their own fears, but also the emotional well-being of their children. Young ones asked questions about their father's whereabouts, safety, and eventual return. Questions that mothers answered with reassurances they themselves did not fully believe. Older children sensed the gravity of the situation more clearly, interpreting whispered conversations or reading tension in their mother's expressions. Mothers shielded their children from the full truth, but the strain showed nonetheless in sleepless nights, shortened tempers, or moments of quiet grief when they believed no one was watching. Widows bore the heaviest emotional burden of all. As death notifications arrived, delivered by telegram or officials, the rhythm of rural life halted. The farm, once a symbol of family continuity, suddenly became a reminder of irreversible loss. Widows often felt compelled to return to work quickly, both out of necessity and as a means of coping. Their grief blended into the relentless cycle of chores, each familiar task carrying echoes of the men who had once shared them. The empty chair at the kitchen table, the unused coat hanging by the door, and the silent tools in the barn became daily reminders of absence. And yet, widows persevered, driven by a need to maintain stability for their children and preserve the family farm for future generations. Community support played a vital role in helping women bear these emotional strains. Rural villages had strong traditions of solidarity, and neighbors frequently stepped in to offer comfort, share meals, or assist with heavy farm tasks. Women, in particular, formed powerful emotional bonds with one another, bonds strengthened by shared hardship, whispered confessions, and mutual understanding. These friendships became lifelines, offering spaces where women could express vulnerabilities they concealed from their children or community leaders. Despite the hardships, many women found ways to maintain hope. They drew strength from faith, traditions, and small moments of beauty in rural life, a blooming apple tree, a successful harvest, or a child's laughter. For some, hope was nurtured by the belief that their sacrifices would be rewarded when their loved ones returned. For others, it was a more fragile, trembling hope, sustained by sheer endurance rather than conviction. Yet the emotional landscape was not defined solely by sorrow. Some women discovered a newfound sense of capability and independence. Managing farms, handling finances, making decisions, and negotiating with officials revealed strengths they had not previously recognized. Though born of necessity, these acts of self-reliance reshaped their identities. Women realized they were far more capable than society had once acknowledged, and this awakening laid the groundwork for subtle but lasting shifts in gender dynamics after the war. Still, guilt often crept into their emotional lives. Women who felt pride in their accomplishments sometimes feared that such feelings betrayed their absent husbands. Others struggled with resentment toward the war, toward the authorities, or even toward their spouses for leaving them with immense burdens. These emotions were rarely voiced aloud, suppressed under layers of duty and cultural expectation. Fear was a constant presence as well. Rumors circulated about defeats at the front, shortages worsened, and foreign laborers or refugees brought stories of devastation. Women worried not only about the fate of their loved ones, but also about the future of their farms, their livelihoods, and their children's prospects. Some nights fear twisted into nightmares. Other nights it manifested in compulsive overwork, as though keeping busy could keep disaster at bay. As the war drew closer to its end, the emotional tension grew almost unbearable. Women listened anxiously to distant artillery, saw fires glow on the horizon, or heard stories of advancing armies. The unknown loomed large. Would their husbands return? Would their farms survive? Would they face violence or loss as the front lines shifted? Every emotion intensified in these final months. Hope, dread, exhaustion, and resilience
blending into a single, overwhelming state of uncertainty.
The final months of the war brought seismic changes to rural Germany, sudden, destabilizing, and emotionally overwhelming. What had once felt distant, muffled by forests, fields, and geographical isolation, now arrived at the doorstep of every farmstead. The countryside, long believed to be sheltered, became a stage for collapse, flight, hunger, rumors, chaos, and ultimately liberation. For the women who had carried the burden of rural survival for years, the war's end was not a single moment, but a slow, unpredictable unraveling of an entire world. As Germany's front lines disintegrated, retreating soldiers streamed through rural villages in broken formations. Some were exhausted teenagers, others were wounded veterans, limping or carried by makeshift carts. Women on farms watched them pass silently, torn between compassion and fear. Their presence confirmed what everyone already suspected. The front was no longer a distant battlefield, but a rapidly approaching reality. With them came whispers of devastating defeats, lost cities, encircled armies, and the unstoppable advance of Allied forces. These stories, fragmented, contradictory, and terrifying, spread rapidly, igniting both panic and resignation throughout the countryside. At the same time, local Nazi officials attempted to maintain control. Propaganda broadcasts insisted that miracle weapons would turn the tide while warning civilians against defeatism. But rural women, whose lives had taught them to read the land, the weather, and human behavior with settled precision, sensed the truth. They saw the desperation in the soldiers' faces, the thinning supply lines, the disappearance of younger male officials, and the frantic attempt to recruit older men and boys into the Volkssturm. Many mothers hid their teenage sons, refusing to sacrifice them to a hopeless fight. This quiet rebellion, undertaken at great personal risk, was an act of fierce maternal courage that shaped the final months of life on the land. With the state collapsing, rural life became a battleground of uncertainty. Fuel vanished, tools wore down, and livestock losses increased. Hunger deepened as rationing systems fell apart, and chaos disrupted deliveries. Women stretched their remaining supplies with remarkable ingenuity, turning to forgotten recipes, wild plants, bartering networks, and sheer perseverance. The countryside, once imagined as Germany's breadbasket, now experienced scarcity as acute as that in any city. Rural women used every skill passed down through generations to keep their families alive. Meanwhile, foreign laborers, prisoners of war, and forced workers began to sense liberation was near. Years of mistreatment, surveillance, and rigid control loosened as the German state weakened. Some fled into forests, others waited cautiously, unsure of what the approaching Allied armies would bring. Relations between rural women and these workers shifted in complex ways, ranging from fear to uneasy cooperation to acts of compassion, such as sharing bread or offering a place to sleep during chaotic nights. As authority dissolved, many women focused on preserving peace within their own farms, hoping to avoid violence or reprisals. Then came the moment that changed everything, the arrival of Allied forces. Whether it was American troops in the West, British units in the North, or Soviet forces advancing from the East, each region experienced liberation differently. For many rural women, the first signs were distant artillery booms or columns of smoke rising above nearby towns. Some locked themselves in their homes, others gathered their children and sought refuge in barns or cellars. Rumors of violence, particularly in regions overrun by the Red Army, caused widespread fear. Women prepared as best they could, hiding valuables, securing livestock, or clinging to family members in darkened rooms. Yet liberation also brought profound relief. The foreign soldiers who entered villages were often the first humans in years who represented a world beyond war, scarcity, and propaganda. Some troops were cautious and respectful, others were wary after years of fighting.
The interactions varied, but for many women, the realization that the war was truly over brought an emotional release unlike anything they had known. Tears flowed freely, tears of exhaustion, grief, fear, and fragile hope. In the weeks that followed, rural life entered a new phase, the aftermath. This was a time of reckoning, rebuilding, and reorientation. Women bore the heaviest responsibilities. With the Nazi administration dismantled, they had to navigate new systems imposed by occupying authorities, registering families, accounting for livestock, declaring stored grain, and adapting to new rules about land use and production. They also had to confront the emotional reality of devastation. Loved ones missing, husbands dead or imprisoned, sons scattered across Europe, and futures reshaped overnight. The return of surviving soldiers was one of the most emotional moments in rural communities. Some came home unexpectedly, gaunt and traumatized. Reunions were bittersweet, filled with joy, sorrow, and the enormous challenge of rebuilding relationships fractured by years of separation. Others never returned, leaving women to shoulder the role of permanent heads of household. Widows, already worn by years of labor and grief, now had to secure their farms' futures alone. Their strength defined the post-war countryside. Rural communities also had to confront their past. Some women had cooperated with local authorities out of fear or necessity. Others had quietly resisted. In the post-war atmosphere of judgment, suspicion, and denazification, these histories resurfaced. Yet women, often excluded from formal political roles, had been more focused on survival than ideology. Their primary concerns, protecting children, securing food, maintaining farms, had given them a perspective grounded not in politics but in human endurance. Despite the trauma, the post-war countryside slowly began to regenerate. Seeds were planted, tools repaired, livestock replenished. Women who had spent years holding their families together now guided the rebuilding process with a mixture of determination and weary hope. The natural world offered a kind of healing. Spring blossoms, green fields, and the hum of bees returning to orchards. These familiar rhythms reassured rural communities that life, however changed, would continue.